lost world of ancient Egypt, beyond pyramids and pharaohs. Asleep in class. Asleep in class. Welcome or welcome back to Asleep in Class, where we settle into long, quiet lectures about history, science, invention, civilization, and the strange paths of human knowledge. This episode follows ancient Egypt beyond the familiar images of pyramids and pharaohs, into a world of river fields, desert villages, divine kingship, scribes, temples, tombs, priests, empire, Nubia, conquest, Alexandria, Rome, Christianity, and memory. It is a calm journey through one of history's most enduring civilizations, not as a frozen monument, but as a living world remade across thousands of years. Before the pharaohs, river, desert, villages, and the making of Egypt. Long before the pyramids rose above the desert plateau, long before the names of Khufu, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Ramesses, or Cleopatra became part of world memory, the land that would become ancient Egypt was already shaped by a remarkable meeting of water and desert. Egypt was not born only from kings. It grew from landscapes, seasons, villages, craft traditions, burial customs, and the repeated work of people learning how to live along a narrow green corridor between dry lands. The Nile was central to this world, but it should not reduce Egypt to a simple river story. The river mattered because it created a dependable floodplain in an otherwise harsh environment. Each year, the Nile flood deposited rich silt across fields, making farming possible on a scale that could support villages, towns, temples, officials, soldiers, craftsmen, and kings. But the desert mattered too. It formed boundaries, protected settlements in some directions, preserved burials and artifacts, provided stone and minerals, and shaped the Egyptian sense of order against chaos. Early Egypt was a world of farmers, herders, potters, hunters, fishers, traders, and local elites. People grew cereals such as emmer wheat and barley. They raised cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. They made pottery, baskets, stone tools, beads, cosmetic palettes, linen, and ritual objects. Mud brick houses clustered near fields and canals. Granaries stored food. Graves became places where social difference, belief, and memory could be expressed through objects placed with the dead. The Predynastic period, before the first dynasties, different regional cultures developed along the Nile Valley and Delta. Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north were not yet a single state. They had their own centers, elite networks, symbols, and local power structures. Over time, competition and consolidation strengthened some rulers over others. Burial goods became richer in elite graves. Symbols of authority became more formal. Craft production became more specialized. Long-distance exchange brought materials such as obsidian, lapis lazuli, cedar, copper, ivory, and precious stones through complicated networks. The process of unification is often associated with King Narmer, whose famous palette shows a ruler wearing the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt and performing acts of domination. The Narmer palette is one of the most iconic objects from early Egyptian history, but it should be treated carefully. It is not a newspaper report of a single event. It is a ritual and political image, showing power, victory, symbolism, and kingship. It suggests the ideology of unification as much as the mechanics of unification. By the beginning of the dynastic period, Egypt had developed one of the ancient world's most durable ideas of kingship. The king was not simply a military leader or local chieftain. He was connected to cosmic order. He stood between the human world and the divine. He was responsible for maintaining Mad, a concept that can be translated imperfectly as truth, balance, justice, order, and rightness. Mad was not only moral behavior, it was the proper arrangement of the universe. The flood arriving, the fields growing, offerings being made, enemies being restrained, the dead being honored, and the gods receiving what was due. This does not mean Egypt was peaceful or timeless. Early kingship involved violence, labor, hierarchy, and control. The state needed grain, manpower, storage, taxation, building projects, scribes, and officials. The same order that created stability also created obligation. Villagers could be drawn into systems of work, tribute, and administration. The rise of the Egyptian state was therefore both impressive and demanding. It created monuments, but it also organized lives. Writing emerged in this early context. Egyptian hieroglyphs were not invented merely for decoration. They served administration, ritual, ownership, identity, and memory. Early labels and inscriptions helped connect goods, names, places, and royal authority. Writing allowed the state to record, command, commemorate, and sacralize. It gave kings another way to endure beyond death. It also gave Egypt one of its most recognizable visual languages. The first dynasties established royal cemeteries, ceremonial centers, and administrative systems that would shape later history. Memphis became an important center near the meeting point of Upper and Lower Egypt. Abydos became associated with early royal burials and later with the cult of Osiris. The map of Egyptian memory was already forming. Places were not just locations, but sacred and political landscapes. Ordinary people still lived in houses of mud brick, worked fields, baked bread, brewed beer, mended tools, raised children, tended animals, and participated in local religious life. Their names are less famous than those of kings, but their labor made Egyptian civilization possible. Without farmers, there could be no temple offerings. Without potters, weavers, stonecutters, brewers, herders, and builders, there could be no palace economy. Without families preserving memory, there could be no long tradition of ancestor care and burial. Egypt's earliest history is therefore not only a prelude to pyramids. It is a story of environment becoming society, society becoming state, and state becoming sacred kingship. The pyramids would later dominate the horizon, but before them came mud brick villages, desert cemeteries, symbolic palettes, early writing, cattle pens, grain stores, local chiefs, river fields, and generations of people learning how to turn seasonal abundance into enduring order. The lost world of ancient Egypt begins there. not with a stone monument, but with a floodplain at dawn, a village at the desert edge, smoke rising from ovens, cattle moving near fields, jars stacked in storage rooms, and a ruler's name beginning to outlast the breath of the person who carried it. Early Egyptian identity also formed through contrast. The black land, the fertile soil of the floodplain, stood against the red land, the desert beyond cultivation. This was not merely a color difference. It became a way of imagining order and danger, life and death, field and wilderness, the settled world and the untamed edge. The desert could threaten, but it could also preserve, protect, and sanctify. Graves placed in dry ground survived in ways that ordinary village houses did not. This is why the earliest periods of Egypt are both intimate and mysterious. We can see pottery styles, burial positions, pallets, tools, beads, and animal remains, but we cannot hear most of the voices clearly. The written record was only beginning. Archaeology carries much of the story. It shows us a society becoming more organized before it could fully explain itself in words. The silence is part of the atmosphere, a civilization gathering shape before its later monuments made it world famous. Divine kingship, labor, and the Pyramid Age. The pyramids are the most famous monuments of ancient Egypt, but they are often surrounded by misunderstanding. They were not isolated riddles dropped into the desert. They were part of a wider system of kingship, labor, religion, engineering, administration, and belief. To understand them, we have to see the Old Kingdom not only as an age of gigantic stone, but as an age of organization. The Pyramid Age began with experimentation. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, built in the 3rd dynasty, is traditionally associated with the official Imhotep. It rose from earlier forms of royal tomb architecture and transformed them into something new, a stepped stone monument within a larger funerary complex. Imhotep later became a legendary figure, remembered as a wise architect and healer, but the historical details are limited. What matters is that the step pyramid shows a state capable of mobilizing stone, skilled labor, design, ritual planning, and long-term construction. The pyramids at Giza belong to the 4th dynasty, especially the reigns of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. The Great Pyramid of Khufu remains one of the largest and most extraordinary monuments ever built. Its construction required quarrying, transporting, shaping, and placing millions of stone blocks. It required planners, overseers, quarry workers, haulers, masons, tool makers, rope makers, cooks, bakers, brewers, scribes, and priests. It required food supply, work scheduling, measurement, and administration. The people who built the pyramids were not slaves in the popular cinematic sense. Evidence from worker settlements, tombs, food remains, and inscriptions suggests organized labor forces, including skilled workers and rotating crews, supported by state resources. Some labor may have been obligatory service owed to the state, especially during seasons when agricultural work was less demanding. But the image of masses of foreign slaves whipped endlessly across the sand is not the best historical model for the pyramid builders. This does not mean the work was easy or voluntary in a modern sense. Ancient states could compel labor. They could demand service, organize crews, and direct human bodies toward royal projects. The pyramid is therefore both a religious monument and a political fact. It shows belief in the king's afterlife, but also the state's ability to gather food, people, tools, stone, and time. It is a mountain of theology and logistics. The pharaoh's role was cosmic. The king was associated with divine power and with the maintenance of Mad. In death, the king's transformation was linked to the gods, the sun, the stars, and the renewal of order. Pyramid complexes included temples, causeways, offering chapels, subsidiary burials, boat pits, and ritual spaces. They were not simply tombs sealed and forgotten. They were centers for ongoing offerings and memory. Pyramid texts, first known from later Old Kingdom royal pyramids, give us some of the earliest extended religious writings in Egypt. These texts include spells, utterances, and ritual language intended to help the king in the afterlife. They show a world in which death was not an end, but a dangerous passage requiring words, offerings, divine associations, and ritual knowledge. The king hoped to rise, join the gods, travel with the sun, or become one among the imperishable stars. The shape of the pyramid itself may have carried solar meaning. Later Egyptian religious thought connected the dead king with the sun god Ra, and the pyramid's geometry, rising toward the sky, fits a world where light, horizon, ascent, and renewal mattered deeply. But we should be careful not to pretend that one explanation solves everything. Egyptian monuments often carried multiple meanings at once: political, religious, astronomical, visual, dynastic, and ritual. Around the royal monuments, other people were buried too. Officials, nobles, priests, and members of elite households built mastaba tombs and later decorated tomb chapels. Their inscriptions and reliefs show scenes of food production, hunting, fishing, craft, offerings, and estate life. These images were not simple snapshots. They were idealized and magical in function, meant to sustain the deceased in the next world. Still, they preserve extraordinary details about labor, animals, tools, clothing, boats, fields, and social hierarchy. Old Kingdom Egypt was a society of ranked dependence. At the top was the king. Around him were royal family members, high officials, priests, scribes, overseers, and estate managers. Beneath them were farmers, craftsmen, herders, laborers, servants, and many people whose names rarely survive. The state and elite institutions controlled land, labor, and stored wealth. Temples and royal estates were economic as well as religious centers. Scribes were essential. They recorded deliveries, counted grain, tracked workers, copied orders, managed estates, and preserved names. In a society where writing was limited to a trained minority, literacy was power. The scribe did not need to lift a stone to help build a pyramid. He could make the system of stone lifting possible by recording who was present, who was fed, what was delivered, and what was owed. The pyramid age eventually changed. Central royal power weakened after the Old Kingdom. Provincial elites became more important. Climate stress, low Nile floods, administrative strain, and political fragmentation may all have contributed to the transition into the first intermediate period, though historians debate the balance of causes. Later Egyptians remembered this period as one of disorder, but it was also a time of regional culture, local power, and adaptation. The pyramids remained, even as the political world that made them changed. That is one reason they became such powerful symbols. They outlived the kings who ordered them, the workers who built them, the priests who served them, and the administrative systems that maintained them. They stood through later dynasties, foreign conquests, Greek rule, Roman rule, Islamic history, European travelers, archaeology, tourism, and modern imagination. But if we want to see beyond pyramids and pharaohs, we should not ignore the pyramids. We should see them more clearly. They were not magic tricks, alien puzzles, or empty monuments of vanity. They were products of a state that understood labor, measurement, belief, food supply, stone, writing, ritual, and royal memory. They were built by human beings whose work was organized through systems, both impressive and demanding. The Pyramid Age reveals one of ancient Egypt's deepest truths. Eternity was never effortless. It had to be quarried, dragged, carved, counted, fed, prayed over, sealed, reopened in ritual, named in writing, and defended against forgetting. The king hoped to live forever, but forever required an entire society. The pyramid complexes also changed the surrounding landscape. Causeways connected valley temples to mortuary temples. Priests served cults that were intended to continue long after the king's burial. Settlements, storage areas, harbors or landing places, and work zones clustered around royal projects. The pyramid was therefore not a lonely triangle in empty sand. It was part of a sacred and administrative environment. The workers themselves were fed on a large scale. Bread, beer, meat, fish, onions, and other supplies had to be produced and delivered. Even the simplest meal represented a chain of labor. Fields harvested, grain ground, dough prepared, ovens heated, beer brewed, animals managed, pottery made, and rations distributed. A pyramid rises upward, but its foundation reaches outward into farms, bakeries, breweries, workshops, and storehouses. The Old Kingdom teaches us that monumentality is never only about stone. It is about time. It is about persuading or compelling thousands of actions to line up toward one purpose. Every block placed correctly meant someone had planned, measured, cut, hauled, lifted, adjusted, and recorded. The pyramid is impressive because it is huge, but it is even more impressive because it represents coordination across years. Temples, scribes, gods, and the machinery of eternity. Ancient Egypt was not only a land of tombs, it was a land of temples, offerings, calendars, festivals, priests, scribes, statues, sacred animals, household amulets, and daily rituals meant to preserve the balance between the human world and the divine. Egyptian religion was not a single simple belief system. It changed across time, differed by place and included many gods, myths, cult centers, local traditions, and theological combinations. At the center of Egyptian order was Mad, truth, balance, justice, rightness, and cosmic harmony. The king was responsible for maintaining Mad, but he could not personally perform every ritual in every temple. Priests acted on his behalf. In theory, temple ritual renewed the relationship between gods, king, land, and people. In practice, temples were also major economic institutions with land, workers, storage facilities, workshops, herds, scribes, and political influence. A temple was not a public church in the modern sense. The deepest sacred spaces were restricted. The god's cult statue was housed within the temple, cared for through daily ritual. Priests washed, clothed, perfumed, offered food to, and honored the divine image. Offerings presented to the god could later be redistributed among temple personnel. Ritual and economy were intertwined. Feeding, the gods also fed the institution. The design of Egyptian temples expressed sacred order. Monumental pylons, courtyards, hypostyle halls, sanctuaries, processional ways, obelisks, statues, reliefs, and sacred lakes all shaped movement from the outer world toward deeper sacred space. Columns could resemble papyrus or lotus plants. Ceilings might show stars. Walls displayed kings smiting enemies, offering to gods, receiving life, and participating in cosmic renewal. The temple was a building, but also a model of the ordered universe. The gods themselves formed a vast and flexible world. Ra was associated with the sun, Osiris with death, resurrection, kingship, and the afterlife. Isis with magic, motherhood, protection, and devotion. Horus with kingship and the sky. Hathor with music, love, joy, motherhood, and the western lands of the dead. Anubis with embalming and burial. Amun rose to enormous importance, especially in Thebes, and could be combined with Ra as Amun-Ra. Ta was important at Memphis. Thoth was associated with writing, wisdom, and calculation. Sekhmet could embody destructive and protective power. Egyptian gods should not be imagined as cartoon characters with fixed roles. Their meanings overlapped, changed, merged, and shifted by region and period. A god could be local and universal, gentle and dangerous, cosmic and intimate. The same deity could appear in temple theology, royal ideology, household devotion, funerary texts, and protective amulets. Scribes helped hold this religious world together. They copied texts, recorded offerings, managed accounts, wrote letters, trained students, and preserved knowledge. Hieroglyphs were used for monumental and sacred writing, while hieratic and later demotic scripts served more practical and administrative purposes. Writing could be beautiful, magical, bureaucratic, poetic, or economic depending on context. A scribal palette, reed pens, ink, papyrus, ostraca, and practice boards belonged to the machinery of Egyptian civilization. A scribe might record grain deliveries, copy a hymn, draft a legal document, list temple goods, or teach students. Writing made power durable. It allowed names to survive. It allowed rituals to be repeated. It allowed officials to manage work and temples to preserve wealth. It allowed the dead to speak. Funerary belief became one of the most famous parts of Egyptian religion. Egyptians cared deeply about death because they cared deeply about continuity. The body, name, shadow, heart, ka, ba, and other aspects of personhood all belonged to a complex afterlife imagination. Mummification was one method of preserving the body so that the deceased could continue in the next world. It was not available in the same way to everyone, and its practices changed over time. Mummification involved drying the body, treating it with natron, wrapping it in linen, using resins and oils, and placing amulets or protective objects with the deceased. The process could be elaborate for elites and simpler for others. The goal was not horror. It was preservation, transformation, and protection. The dead needed care. They needed offerings, spells, tomb images, names, and memory. The Book of the Dead is a modern name for collections of funerary spells used especially in the New Kingdom and later. These texts were intended to help the deceased navigate dangers, speak correctly, transform, and be judged. The famous weighing of the heart scene shows the heart weighed against the feather of mad. If the heart was true, the deceased could continue. If not, destruction threatened. This image is powerful because it links ethics, cosmic order, identity, and afterlife hope. Tombs were therefore not only graves. They were houses of eternity, ritual devices, memory chambers, and artistic worlds. Tomb paintings could show banquets, agriculture, hunting, fishing, craft production, offerings, musicians, dancers, family members, servants, and gods. These were not merely decorations. They helped create an eternal environment. To paint food was to help provide food. To preserve a name was to keep a person from disappearing. Religion also lived outside great temples and tombs. Ordinary Egyptians used amulets, household shrines, prayers, local festivals, protective images, and healing rituals. They feared illness, childbirth danger, snakebite, drowning, hunger, and the anger of forces beyond control. Religion met daily vulnerability. A mother protecting a child, a worker carrying an amulet, a family honoring the dead, or a village joining a festival all belonged to Egyptian religious life. Priests were not always permanently full-time in the way modern religious roles might suggest. Some served in rotations. Some held other administrative or elite roles. Temple service could bring status, income, and influence. Over time, especially in major cult centers such as Thebes, priesthoods could become extremely powerful. The temple was a sacred place, but also a political and economic force. The machinery of eternity was therefore vast. It included fields growing grain for offerings, workshops making linen and incense, scribes recording accounts, priests performing rituals, embalmers preparing bodies, artists painting tombs, stonecutters carving names, families making offerings, and kings presenting themselves as guardians of mad. Eternity was not an abstraction. It was maintained through daily work. This is one of the reasons ancient Egypt feels so enduring. It built systems for memory. It carved names into stone. It wrapped bodies in linen. It painted food that would never rot. It placed stars on ceilings. It turned writing into sacred image. It made temples into stone landscapes of cosmic order. It made the afterlife not a vague hope, but a geography filled with gates, spells, dangers, fields, gods, judgments, and reunions. To go beyond pyramids and pharaohs is to enter this quieter but deeper world. The priest opening a shrine before dawn, the scribe grinding ink, the family leaving offerings, the embalmers working in solemn concentration, the artist painting a marsh scene in a tomb, the temple storehouse receiving grain, the festival procession carrying a god's image into public view, and the dead hoping their names will be spoken again. Temples also served as theaters of kingship. Reliefs show the king making offerings, defeating chaos, receiving life from the gods, and participating in rituals that renewed the world. Many of these scenes repeated formulas across centuries. That repetition was not a lack of imagination. It was part of the power. Ritual images gained authority because they belonged to a known order. They made the present ruler part of an older pattern. Festivals sometimes brought divine images out from the hidden sanctuary into a more public sacred landscape. Processions allowed communities to encounter the gods in motion. Music, incense, food, boats carried on shoulders, priests, singers, dancers, and crowds could transform temple religion into collective experience. For ordinary people, these moments may have been among the most direct contacts with the great cults of the land. Even personal piety grew more visible in some periods. People left stelae, prayers, votive offerings, and small objects asking for help or giving thanks. They appealed to gods who could hear, protect, heal, and judge. The grand theology of temples and kings existed beside private fear, hope, grief, and gratitude. Egyptian religion endured partly because it could operate at both scales: cosmic order and household need, empire, war, Nubia, and the world beyond Egypt. Ancient Egypt is sometimes imagined as isolated, sealed between desert and river. But Egypt was always connected to surrounding worlds. It traded, fought, negotiated, borrowed, influenced, and was influenced. Its history reached into Nubia, the Levant, the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Eastern Desert, the oases, and the wider networks of the ancient Near East. Egypt was not only a civilization of monuments, it was also a regional power. The Middle Kingdom, after the turmoil of the First Intermediate Period, brought renewed central authority and cultural achievement. Kings of the 11th and 12th dynasties restored unity, expanded administration, supported literature, built monuments, and strengthened Egypt's presence in Nubia. Fortresses in Nubia helped control movement, trade, military access, and resources such as gold. These forts show a strategic world of garrisons, messengers, supply lines, desert routes, and frontier command. Nubia was not merely Egypt's southern background. It had its own cultures, rulers, resources, and histories. Egyptians valued Nubian gold, cattle, ivory, ebony, incense, and access to African trade routes. Nubian archers were famous. Egyptian states sometimes conquered parts of Nubia, sometimes traded with Nubians, sometimes employed Nubians, and sometimes feared or fought Nubian power. Later, the kingdom of Kush would become strong enough to rule Egypt during the 25th dynasty, producing Nubian pharaohs who saw themselves as restorers of ancient Egyptian tradition. This relationship reminds us that Egypt's identity was not fixed only by its northern monuments. The southern world mattered deeply. Gold from Nubia helped fund temples, diplomacy, and royal display. Frontier forts helped project power. Cultural influence moved in both directions. Nubian elites adopted and adapted Egyptian symbols while retaining their own identities and traditions. The line between Egypt and Nubia was not just a border. It was a zone of exchange, domination, resistance, imitation, and reinvention. Egypt also faced change from the northeast. During the Second Intermediate Period, rulers known as the Hyksos controlled parts of northern Egypt from the delta. They were connected to Western Asia and brought or helped spread military technologies and practices, including horse-drawn chariots and certain weapons. Egyptian texts later remembered them in hostile terms, but history is more complicated than royal propaganda. The Hyksos were not simply invaders in a modern nationalist story. They were part of a broader world of migration, settlement, trade, and political fragmentation. The expulsion of the Hyksos helped launch the New Kingdom, one of Egypt's most powerful imperial periods. New Kingdom pharaohs expanded Egyptian influence into Nubia and the Levant. They fought campaigns, built temples, collected tribute, sent diplomats, and presented themselves as world rulers. The military image of the pharaoh became especially strong. King in chariot, king smiting enemies, king favored by Amun, king expanding order beyond Egypt's borders. Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most famous rulers, reigned as a female pharaoh in the 18th dynasty. Her monuments present her with the full symbols of kingship. Her reign is associated with building projects and with the famous expedition to Punt, a land or region probably located somewhere around the southern Red Sea or Horn of Africa area, though its exact location remains debated. Scenes from her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri show exotic trees, incense, goods, ships, and foreign landscapes. They are among the most vivid images of Egypt's outward reach. Thutmose III, who ruled after Hatshepsut, became one of Egypt's greatest military pharaohs. His campaigns in the Levant helped establish Egyptian dominance over city-states and trade routes. Egyptian empire in Asia did not mean modern direct rule everywhere. It often worked through vassal rulers, tribute, garrisons, hostages, diplomacy, and displays of force. The empire was a system of pressure and relationship as much as a colored area on a map. The Amarna letters, written in Akkadian cuneiform on clay tablets, reveal Egypt's diplomatic world in the 14th century BCE. They include correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and rulers of other great powers, as well as letters from vassal rulers in the Levant. These letters show a world of gifts, marriages, complaints, requests for gold, accusations, military anxieties, and diplomatic etiquette. Egypt was part of an international system involving powers such as Babylonia, Assyria, Mitanni, Hatti, and city-states of the eastern Mediterranean. Akhenaten, one of the most controversial pharaohs, tried to elevate the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, in a dramatic religious and political shift. He moved the capital to Akhetaten, modern Amarna, and promoted art and theology that differed sharply from earlier traditions. Whether this was monotheism in a strict modern sense is debated. What is clear is that his reforms disrupted powerful religious institutions, especially the cult of Amun. After his death, traditional cults returned, and his memory was later suppressed. Tutankhamun is famous today mostly because his tomb was discovered relatively intact in 1922 by Howard Carter. Historically, he was a young king of the post-Amarna restoration, not one of Egypt's greatest rulers. His fame tells us something important about modern memory. Survival of evidence can matter as much as ancient political significance. A less powerful king can become globally famous because his tomb preserved gold, furniture, chariots, shrines, masks, and personal objects that allow modern people to imagine ancient Egypt in extraordinary detail. Ramesses II of the 19th dynasty became one of Egypt's most celebrated pharaohs. His reign was long, monumentally ambitious, and politically powerful. He fought the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, one of the best documented battles of the Bronze Age, though Egyptian inscriptions presented it in highly self-glorifying terms. Eventually, Egypt and Hatti concluded a famous peace treaty. Ramesses built extensively, including temples at Abu Simbel and additions to Karnak and Luxor. His monuments made him seem almost larger than history. But Egypt's power was not permanent. The late Bronze Age world entered crisis around the 12th century BCE. Palace systems, trade routes, and states across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East suffered disruption. Egypt faced attacks associated with groups known from Egyptian texts as Sea Peoples, as well as pressure from Libyans and others. Ramesses III claimed victories against invaders, but Egypt's imperial strength weakened over time. The new kingdom gave way to a more fragmented political landscape. Egypt continued after empire. That is essential. Decline from imperial height did not mean disappearance. Priests, local rulers, Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans all became part of Egypt's later history. Egyptian temples continued. Egyptian writing continued. Egyptian gods continued. Local communities continued to farm, worship, trade, marry, bury their dead, and reinterpret tradition. The world beyond Egypt was not merely a threat. It was also part of Egypt's identity. Nubian gold, Levantan diplomacy, Aegean goods, Near Eastern weapons, Libyan settlement, Kushite rule, Persian administration, Greek kingship, and Roman taxation all became woven into the long story. Egypt influenced others, but it was also changed by others. Its endurance came not from being untouched, but from absorbing, resisting, and surviving change. Empire also created moral tension. Egyptian monuments often present foreign lands as disorderly places brought under pharaonic control. Bound enemies, tribute bearers, and smiting scenes appear again and again. These images supported the ideology of Mad by showing the king defeating chaos. But they were not neutral portraits of other peoples. They were political art. They tell us how Egypt wanted power to look. Behind the images were real human consequences. Campaigns meant prisoners, tribute, forced labor, garrisons, diplomatic marriages, hostage-taking, and shifting loyalties. Trade and war often traveled the same roads. A border fort might receive goods one season and prepare for conflict the next. A foreign ruler might be an enemy, a vassal, a partner, or a relative through diplomacy. Egypt's empire was not simply glorious expansion. It was a complicated system of pressure, wealth, fear, and negotiation. The New Kingdom also produced some of Egypt's most famous temples and tombs. The Valley of the Kings, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, and royal monuments across Egypt and Nubia show how imperial wealth fed religious and architectural ambition. Gold, labor, stone, military victory, priestly power, and royal image all reinforced one another. The empire was visible not only on battle reliefs, but in columns, obelisks, colossal statues, painted tombs, and processional avenues. After the Pharaohs, conquest, Alexandria, Rome, Christianity, and memory. The end of ancient Egypt was not a single moment. There was no day when the pyramids stopped meaning anything, when the gods vanished, or when Egyptian civilization simply disappeared. Instead, Egypt changed through conquest, adaptation, foreign rule, religious transformation, language shift, and memory. The later story of Egypt is one of the most important reasons the phrase, beyond pyramids and pharaohs, matters. During the late period, Egypt was ruled by native dynasties at times and by foreign powers at others. Assyrians invaded. Persians conquered Egypt and made it part of the Achaemenid Empire. Egyptians resisted, rebelled, collaborated, adapted, and continued their religious and administrative lives under changing rulers. Foreign rule did not erase Egypt, but it did alter the political meaning of kingship. A Persian king could present himself as pharaoh in Egyptian contexts, using old forms of legitimacy while ruling within a much larger empire. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great conquered Egypt from the Persians. He founded Alexandria, which would become one of the great cities of the ancient Mediterranean. After Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy took control of Egypt and founded the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greek rulers, but they adopted Egyptian royal imagery and supported Egyptian temples while also building a Greek-speaking court and city culture. Their Egypt was both old and new. Ptolemaic Egypt was not simply Greek pasted over Egyptian tradition. It was layered. Greek settlers, Egyptian priests, native communities, soldiers, administrators, merchants, and scholars all lived within a complex society. Temples continued to function. Priests negotiated privileges. Egyptian religious art and inscriptions continued. At the same time, Greek became a major language of administration and elite culture, especially in Alexandria and other centers. Alexandria became famous for its library, scholars, lighthouse, harbor, and intellectual life. It was not the whole of Egypt, but it was a new kind of Egyptian capital: Mediterranean, Greek-speaking, royal, scholarly, and cosmopolitan. The Library of Alexandria and the Mausoleum became symbols of collected knowledge, even though the history of the library's decline is more complicated than the myth of one catastrophic fire. Alexandria connected Egypt to the wider Hellenistic world. Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, is one of the most famous women in ancient history. Modern culture often remembers her through romance, beauty, and drama, but she was a political ruler navigating an extremely dangerous world. She spoke multiple languages, associated herself with Isis, ruled a wealthy kingdom under Roman pressure, and formed alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Her defeat with Antony by Octavian led to Egypt's annexation by Rome in 30 BCE. When Egypt became a Roman province, its grain wealth made it extraordinarily valuable. Rome depended heavily on Egyptian grain. The emperor controlled Egypt carefully because its resources were strategic. Roman Egypt was a world of tax records, villages, temples, soldiers, Greek-speaking cities, Egyptian peasants, Jewish communities, Roman officials, and continuing local traditions. Many papyri from Roman Egypt preserve everyday life with remarkable detail. Petitions, tax receipts, contracts, letters, school exercises, census records, and complaints. Egyptian religion continued under Greek and Roman rule, but it also changed. Temples were built and decorated in traditional styles, even under Ptolemaic and Roman rulers. Some of the best preserved Egyptian temples, such as Edfu and Dendera, come from these later periods. This surprises many people because they imagine real Egypt as only the Pyramid Age. But later temples show that Egyptian sacred traditions remained creative and active long after the Old Kingdom. At the same time, Egyptian gods traveled outward. Isis became one of the most widely worshipped deities in the Mediterranean world. Her cult spread through Greek and Roman networks, attracting devotees far from Egypt. Egyptian imagery, obelisks, sacred animals, and temple styles fascinated outsiders. Egypt became not only a place, but an idea: ancient, sacred, mysterious, wise, dangerous, and old beyond comparison. Christianity transformed Egypt gradually. Christian communities appeared in Egypt in the Roman period, and Alexandria became an important center of Christian theology. Monasticism developed powerfully in the Egyptian desert, especially through figures such as Anthony and Pachomius. The desert, once associated with tombs, danger, and sacred margins, became a landscape of Christian withdrawal, discipline, prayer, and community. Coptic Christianity preserved elements of Egyptian language in Christian liturgical life. The old temples did not all close at once. Religious change was uneven, local, and often slow. Over time, traditional temple cults lost support under Christian Roman rule. Hieroglyphic writing fell out of use. The ability to read the ancient scripts disappeared. Temples became ruins, churches, quarries, shelters, or memories. Egyptian religion did not end in one dramatic scene. It faded through policy, social change, economic transformation, and the rise of new religious worlds. For many centuries, ancient Egypt was visible but unreadable. Travelers could see temples, obelisks, statues, tombs, and pyramids, but the hieroglyphs remained mysterious. Medieval Arab scholars, local communities, European travelers, collectors, and later colonial powers all encountered Egypt through their own assumptions. The modern discipline of Egyptology developed in the wake of European imperial expansion, especially after Napoleon's expedition and the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799. Jean-François Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphs in the 1820s opened ancient Egyptian writing to modern scholarship. This rediscovery was powerful, but it was also entangled with colonialism, looting, museum collecting, and unequal control over Egyptian heritage. Many Egyptian artifacts ended up in European museums. Modern Egyptians, archaeologists, scholars, conservators, and communities continue to debate preservation, ownership, tourism, excavation, and the meaning of the ancient past. Egypt is not only an ancient subject, it is a modern country whose heritage has been admired, exploited, studied, commercialized, and reclaimed. Modern imagination often reduces Egypt to pyramids, mummies, curses, treasure, Cleopatra, and golden masks. These images are powerful, but they can flatten the civilization. Ancient Egypt was also farmers repairing irrigation channels, women managing households, workers baking bread and brewing beer, scribes practicing signs, priests carrying offerings, soldiers guarding forts, Nubian rulers wearing Egyptian crowns, Greek kings honoring Egyptian gods, Roman tax collectors counting grain, monks praying in desert cells, and modern scholars reading names once lost. The lost world of ancient Egypt is not lost because it vanished completely. It is lost because it is too large to fit into the few images most people remember. It survives in monuments, papyri, tomb paintings, statues, temples, broken pottery, language, religion, landscape, museum cases, village memories, and global imagination. It survives because generation after generation found new ways to look back at it. To go beyond pyramids and pharaohs is not to leave them behind. It is to place them inside a wider story. The pyramids belong to Egypt, but so do mud brick villages, temple economies, Nubian frontiers, scribal schools, Ptolemaic courts, Roman tax records, Coptic monasteries, desert ruins, and modern debates over heritage. Pharaohs belong to Egypt, but so do farmers, priests, artisans, soldiers, mothers, children, foreigners, slaves, captives, scribes, and kings whose names were nearly erased. Ancient Egypt endured because it could change. Its symbols were reused. Its gods traveled. Its kingship was adopted by foreigners. Its temples continued under Greek and Roman rulers. Its language transformed. Its monuments were reinterpreted. Its memory became global. It was never only stone. It was never only gold. It was a living civilization, and then a remembered one, and then a rediscovered one, and now still a contested and beloved one. That is why Egypt remains so powerful. A statue half buried in sand can feel like a face from eternity. A tomb painting can make a meal seem fresh after 3,000 years. A papyrus letter can make an ancient voice suddenly ordinary and human. A temple column can still hold the warmth of a vanished ritual. A pyramid can dominate the horizon, but beyond it lies the larger world. Fields, gods, scribes, soldiers, deserts, empires, prayers, ruins, and memory. A civilization does not survive in imagination because it was simple. It survives because every time we think we have reached the center, another doorway opens. The story also continues through language. Ancient Egyptian passed through many written forms across its long history, from hieroglyphic and hieratic to Demotic, and then Coptic, which used the Greek alphabet with additional signs. Coptic preserved the final stage of the Egyptian language in Christian contexts. That means Egyptian did not vanish as soon as foreign rulers arrived. It transformed, carrying older sounds and meanings into a new religious and written world. Memory can be fragile, but it can also be stubborn. Even when hieroglyphs could no longer be read, the monuments remained. Even when temples fell silent, their walls still held images of offerings, stars, kings, gods, and processions. Even when tombs were robbed, fragments survived. Beads, coffin wood, broken statues, jars, names, painted faces, and bits of linen. Egypt's afterlife in human imagination was built from these survivals. The modern viewer must therefore hold two truths together. Ancient Egypt is genuinely magnificent, and ancient Egypt has often been distorted by fantasy, theft, racism, colonialism, and entertainment. To respect it is not to drain away wonder. It is to let the wonder become more accurate. The real Egypt is more interesting than the simplified version because it contains more people, more centuries, more change, more difficulty, and more life.